From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. Essential business. Think about that term. A month back, and I know that feels like a lifetime ago now, we didn't really have to think about what an essential business is. Well, now we know. Healthcare workers, obviously essential. Other businesses like gas stations, public transit, restaurants that offer takeout are all deemed essential too. And one of the most essential of all businesses around the world are grocery stores. The people who work there, the cashiers, the workers who stock the shelves, the delivery drivers who keep the supply chain flowing, they're critical for our society. They are frontline workers, while also being among the lowest paid workers in Canada. They're exposed to many people every single day, and with that, a chance to be infected with the coronavirus. And the danger they're facing is real. Already, a man in Oshawa died after working at a real Canadian superstore.
Keith Saunders had COVID-19 and died Wednesday at the age of 48. Saunders was an employee at this real Canadian superstore in Oshawa, east of Toronto.
So, what about their working conditions? In the US, we've seen major walkouts by workers and delivery drivers for Amazon. Chris Smalls started the movement by leading a strike out of a New York warehouse.
The conditions there are horrific. The items that we use to clean up the buildings are scarce. You got to think, if the medical field don't have PPE to protect the doctors and nurses, the first responders, what makes you think the retail company do? We don't have these things.
And in Canada, grocery giants Lafleche and Sobeys are raising wages.
I'm Galen Weston. The COVID-19 situation is evolving rapidly. Our community includes 190,000 colleagues serving millions of Canadians.
But considering the risk, are big companies doing enough? The employment of so many of us has never felt more uncertain. In mid-March alone, a week after most of society was shut down, nearly 1 million Canadians applied for EI. That's not a sign of a sustainable economy. And now the idea of a universal basic income during this pandemic doesn't feel like such a crazy idea anymore. So today, we're asking, how are our frontline workers being treated? And is this the moment that we rethink the gig economy, what minimum wage looks like, and what risks we're taking for our workplaces? We're talking to two guests from Corporate Knights. They're a media and research company that looks into how business can be improved, of how companies can be run responsibly, ethically, and safely. Toby Heaps is the CEO and editor-in-chief, and Michelynn Lafleche is a senior advisor for Corporate Knights. So guys, let's start with the definition of a few terms that I'm trying to understand. Can you explain the concept of what corporate citizenship is, or at least this idea of corporate responsibility?
Sure. So the idea about corporate citizenship is that the companies don't exist just to make money. When you really think about the history of companies and the values that they provide to society, it's about delivering value for shareholders, yes, but also for the community, for employees, for the supply chain, and also for the planet. And we've seen over the past few years in particular with a large group of CEOs and also a large group of investors have now swung around from that sort of shareholder view of the purpose of a company to more of what they call a stakeholder view, all these different groups. What we've noticed is companies that have done better on this stakeholder performance in terms of looking after their employees, paying their taxes, looking after the planet, they tend to survive for about 80 years before they get acquired or die. Whereas a company, just a normal company, survives a large company for about 40 years. And at a time like this, I think people are really looking for companies who have the power to deliver value for society, to be looking out for everybody, not just their shareholders.
So really, it's in their best interest to not just think about making money, but really think about corporate culture and how they build all of that up.
Yeah, and it's not a win-win wonderland. There are many examples where you can make more money by shorting society or the environment. But increasingly, it's harder to do that. And there's a lot more overlap in that win-win space where doing right by your employees or right by the planet or right by your customers is also the better value proposition for your company in the long term. I think this whole short-sighted model is really kind of coming into full view because people are reflecting on a lot of things right now because we have time at home and a lot of normal functions have been disrupted. And a lot of what has got us to where we are today is that short-sighted mindset. And so I think even though we'd seen in the evidence that having a long-term focus and a stakeholder focus was helping companies in the medium to long term, I think that trend is potentially going to pick up pace in the coming months and years as we come out of this.
Okay, so let's apply that to what's happening right now with the pandemic. In a time of crisis, we know that grocery stores are an essential business and the people who work for them are essential workers. That includes cashiers, people who stock the shelves, people who work in the supply chain. They are essential to keeping our society ticking. So, Michelynn, what kind of responsibility does a major corporation like Loblaws, like Walmart, do they owe to their employees right now?
Well, I think picking up from what Toby was talking about, it is about thinking about the long-term view and the role that employees play in that. Research that I was involved in very recently when I was with United Way and working with McMaster University on poverty and employment precarity in Ontario, we showed that the wages of workers in low-wage jobs have pretty much stagnated or actually declined over the course of nearly a 10-year period for our research that we did, ending in 2018. And during that period, the profits of companies continued to rise. So what was happening was that employees were getting less of a share of the profits, so to speak. And that's true. If you look at the grocery stores, you can see that in the past, grocery store workers actually earned more than they earn today if you did comparable dollars. So they were better jobs. They were kind of middle income jobs, but they're not anymore. They're low income jobs. And what we find in a pandemic situation is that the very services that we need to survive are being staffed by the very people that we've reduced wages of effectively over the course of not the last 10, but the last 30 years. And so we've been treating workers in a way that hasn't necessarily been keeping up their share of the profit at the same time that they are actually in the businesses where we need people most in emergency situations like the one we find ourselves in now.
We've seen grocery companies raise wages by $2 an hour from minimum wage. Sobeys is calling that hero pay. Is a raise of $2 an hour enough, though? I mean, considering the risk that workers are being exposed to every single day.
I think what this pandemic has really revealed is that in a lot of cases, the people that we need the most, we value the least. And so we're taking largely minimum wage earning workers, cashiers, clerks, stockers, and we're adding $2 an hour as compensation, effectively put their lives on the line. At least 3 chains now have confirmed positive tests for the coronavirus by their employees at different grocery stores. And you go in these grocery stores and, they're getting an extra $2 an hour. They still don't have masks being provided by their employers. Loblaw says they're working around the clock to rectify that situation. It looks like they're putting themselves in harm's way for $2 an hour. And they also don't have the security that they feel comfortable that they can go home and not go to work if they're feeling sick without any kind of repercussions on their pay. Because it's really not that practical right now to get a doctor's note or to get confirmation or even getting a test. They don't have rapid access to testing, even though they are essential frontline workers. There's no sort of special consideration. Effectively, the only thing they're getting that's different right now is an extra $2 an hour.
And paid sick leave is very hard to come by for many workers.
On a big picture, it's revealing there's a huge segment of the population that is so desperate for money, they can't even afford to sort of take a week or a month off in a situation like this. There's a lot of people going to work that don't want to go to work.
There are 500,000 McDonald's workers just like me that have to go to work, whether sick or well, because we have no paid sick leave.
And then it reveals, too, that there's a huge segment of our population that if they're unwell, they still need to come to work because it's too much of a hassle to prove and get all the documentation they're unwell. And that's a big risk, not just for these people working in grocery stores, but it's also a big risk for everybody they're interacting with because they're interacting with hundreds of people a day. There's going to be some real opportunities coming out of this, not just to do short-term fixes, but to consider what kind of a social contract we want to have as a society. If we're looking to get ourselves back on the feet after this thing, there's 2 things we could do then as a big social contract to raise the standards, the benefits. And yes, that might mean that lower profits for the shareholders of grocery companies, and it might mean slightly higher prices for customers. But as Michelynn was talking about with her research, the pendulum was swung too far away from the workers. And I think this is revealing that it's time for it to swing back.
Is that a possible solution, at least in the short term, to get that wage higher for frontline workers?
Right now, them going to work, the problem is if they can get sick pay, maybe it's sort of uncertain. They need to have that certainty they can get the sick pay. But if they could get the sick pay, then the grocery stores would have trouble keeping the stores open because who's going to want to come to work if you can stay at home and get the fully sick pay? So if you're just getting an extra 15% or $2 an hour, that might not be enough. So you need a combo. You need a fully paid sick pay, and then you need time and a half for the folks who want to show up. And that's a meaningful reward for them to show up. In order for that to be pulled off, we crunched the numbers on the big four grocers, and they could shoulder that for the next 3 months, and it would erode about half of their dividends and share buybacks. But it probably wouldn't be fair to ask them to shoulder that entire burden because these workers have been declared as essential by governments. Probably be fair to have some kind of burden sharing where the government would pick up some portion of the tab and the grocers would pick up the other. But it's not a question of if we can do it. We do have the resources to do it. The big four grocery stores who control the markets in Canada, they do have the resources, and they have the resources to bring government on side to burden share. And it's not clear that they're making this enough of a priority yet.
There's one side of this that is about wages. The other side, too, is about working conditions. We've heard of the dire need of PPE for healthcare workers. Michelynn, do you think that there should be a similar policy and a need for grocery store workers?
Absolutely. They really are at the front line. Of course, there are lots of people who are on the front lines in different ways. But the grocery store workers, especially the ones who are on the shop floor and at the cash registers, they are encountering hundreds, sometimes thousands of people a day. And I've heard stories from grocery store workers that have been just absolutely appalling of people coming in, being angry because everyone's stressed, but they're angry because the shelves are empty for something that they needed. They're angry because the cashier is the one who has to deliver the message to them that that's not going to come in. It hasn't come in today. It's not going to come in for another 2 days. And I've heard stories of customers spitting at grocery store workers and making terrible remarks, saying things like, "I hope you get the virus." I'm not saying that's happening every single day, but it's happening. And people are at dreadful risk and going in. And this is why workers are afraid to go in. So the more we can prioritize them, alongside or right after the healthcare workers, the police and the firefighters, the better it will be for them. We really do need to step up as a society to name who the people who are serving us need to be reached first with the PPE that comes available and making sure that we get it to them. And we need government on that task, and we need the employers on that task.
You talk about those dangers that they face. I mean, we're seeing that become a direct result of the strikes that we've seen in the US with Amazon, with Instacart. That's very possible here in Canada too. Do you think the major companies are doing enough to keep frontline workers safe?
I think we should give credit where credit's due. And I think that we have seen grocery stores, employers every day stepping up a little bit more. And as they learn more, stepping up a little bit more. And it's tough out there to get the things that they need. But as Toby has said, they're also some of the most powerful companies in this country and some of the biggest employers in this country, meaning that the workforces that are affected under their rule, as it were, are enormous. And so the capacity for change and the capacity for making a deal with government to be able to get better supports in is greater. One of the things that the companies can do together right now is have a code of conduct across every single grocery store in this country. What happens in Toronto is not the same as what's happening in Kelowna, and it's not the same as what's happening in Northern Ontario somewhere. And you should not be allowed to live in one city and have some better protection and live in a small town someplace else and have absolutely nothing. But that is precisely what's happening every single day right now.
Toby, what are these big companies risking if they don't treat their employees the right way?
I think initially they may have thought they weren't risking a lot because the sad reality is a lot of people who work in these stores, they didn't necessarily have a high estimation of themselves. I remember just anecdotally talking to a no-frills cashier, and I was asking her if she could stay home if she wasn't feeling well. And she said yes, but she wouldn't get paid. And when I asked her if she thought if that was fair, she said, well, and she shrugged her shoulders at, we're just minimum wage workers. So I think that was some of the mindset. But I think what's interesting is these people in the front lines, they're being revealed as heroes and they can see what they're doing. It's almost like they're going into battle every day. And yes, they're going in because they need the paycheck, but they are going into battle, just like people who got drafted in the Second World War went into battle. And I think there's a certain honor that they're starting to get and a certain solidarity they're starting to get. And now that we're seeing these strike actions happening, these workers are becoming possibly more assertive. And in that kind of a situation, I think you could see them wielding more power at a time like this. I mean, there's already a mad scramble trying to find talent, people who can afford not to go to work at these places. Many of them are not going to work. And so there's a hiring spree. Every big grocer has stepped up their hiring. I think Amazon's talking about hiring 100,000 new workers. There's job advertisements all over the place for these places because they need people to staff them. So they're starting to think about, they need to keep their stores open, but also over the sort of recovery period that we're going to enter, these workers now are going to have a different view of themselves. It's a really formative time. It's like people who 18, 19-year-olds who went away to fight the great wars of the Second World War, and they came back with a heightened expectation about what society owes them. And so I think we're going to see a heightened expectations, which is a good thing, about what society owes these people who are delivering essential services, not just in times of crisis, but throughout the year, and deserving to be valued what they're giving and not given the short end of the stick.
Our world has definitely shifted since the pandemic became full blown. And it's clear that whenever this ends, our world will look very different. Considering our financial difficulties and what our economy looked like, do you think the pandemic has poked some real holes into the practice of the gig economy and how minimum wage workers are being treated?
Definitely. I think the whole way our economy has been operating is this just in time, no resilience, no extra hospital beds, no extra respirators. And we looked at those things as good, as efficiency. We're operating at 100% efficiency. 100% efficiency is 0% resilience. And I think this is bringing this into the full sort of view. And, if somebody can just afford to survive on one paycheck and they're one paycheck away from destitution, that's not resilience either. And so I think there is going to be a secular recognition across sectors, countries, cultures about the need to have a more resilient society. And that starts with valuing what we need the most, the people we need the most, and the resources and the planetary ecosystem services that we need the most. And so that heightened awareness offers an opportunity, but by no means an assurance that it will happen. Because at the same time, we see, there's all sorts of opportunists that are coming in trying to erode environmental regulations and in some cases labor regulations. So there's going to be a battle. And if the citizenry is engaged, we have a good chance of coming out on the other side in a much better place.
And I think I would just add that the gig economy is really just a reflection of what's happening in the main economy. It's not different, actually. What's happening in the main economy is a hidden gig economy. And that's what's driving the gig economy at the same time. So by resolving some of the situations and the lack of equity and fairness in the mainstream economy, we're going to resolve some of that lack of equity and fairness in the gig economy at the same time. There are many good positive things about flexible work, but we have to make sure that the people who are doing that work are actually benefiting from it as much as the purchasers of that work are, and that we have a system that supports everyone. And that comes back to what Toby said earlier, that we actually have to have, coming out of this, starting now, and I guess it's starting with this conversation, and we've seen a few blogs around this as well, that this conversation about the social contract. Right now, the pendulum has swung, and it's swung that so far that it's hitting the people who can least manage to push back against it. It's on the backs of people who are already breaking, who are bearing the burden of the way in which business is done today. And that has to come backwards. We need government and business to work together. Of course, individuals have to play their role, but we can't be playing the role that we're playing now. It's far too much. It's going to break the individuals, and we need society to step up and say, this is not good enough, and this is not the way we want to live. This is not the way we want to run our society. So let's rethink that.
I've heard the thought that this pandemic in a lot of ways is a reflection of our society, that it's reflected back at us and it exposes the weaknesses. And I suppose just in this case, considering how many of us have lost our jobs, that hundreds of thousands of Canadians have applied for EI, it's clear that pre-pandemic, it really wasn't working for a lot of us.
That's right. And it wasn't working for a lot of us as workers, wasn't working for a lot of small businesses in their engagement as well. I mean, we're seeing people are losing their jobs because small businesses are also collapsing under the pressure of this. I'm sitting in my neighborhood. Of course, I don't go out very much, but I can see, metaphorically, businesses closing around me. It's got to be happening everywhere.
As we come out of this, it's going to be really interesting. We're doing massive, unprecedented experiments in the economy right now that nobody could have imagined a month ago. We just had a Republican Senate in the United States, okay, a basic minimum income granted for a month, but $1,200 every American's getting, they're sending checks out next week. So this idea of a basic income, we used to experiment with it in little precincts in Ontario. Now it's happening in the entire United States of America, 300 million people. And so once those people get that check, it's a pretty interesting idea, providing everyone with a basic level of economic independence and resilience. And it's happening right now in the biggest economy on the planet at the behest of Republicans. I couldn't have imagined that a month ago. And then tax reform. We're going to have to pay for this stuff. We have a tax system that is rotten to the core and unfair by almost any standard, where those who have the most can pay the least or lowest percents, and those who have the least are paying some of the highest effective tax rates. The need for tax reform on multinational corporations, on big tech companies, on capital. These are all things that we have the capacity to do. We're one of the richest countries on the planet with one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios. We have a really unequal tax system that can be reformed and would make us much more efficient and much more productive. And so there's all sorts of paths forward that offer a lot of promise, and we might have a once in a generation or a once in a century opportunity to move those forward in the coming months.
Michelynn, Toby, thank you so much for taking the time here.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks, Adrian.
And that was Toby Heaps and Michelynn Lafleche of Corporate Knights. They're part of a media and research firm that looks into how business can be done ethically and responsibly. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.